So good afternoon. I'm Jen O'Sheal, Director of University Events. We're so glad you can join us at today's event, Bargaining with the Machine, Technology, Surveillance, and the Social Contract with speaker, Professor Robert Pallitto. This session is being recorded and will be posted on our on-demand page after Seton Hall Week concludes for those who were not able to attend. Before we begin, just a few reminders. Again, kindly mute yourself if you haven't already. And if you have any questions during the sessions, please either use the raise your hand icon on the top of your screen, the chat feature to share your questions, or hold your questions until our Q&A session. Our presenter today is Professor Robert Pallitto, professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Affairs at Seton Hall University, and a former public interest lawyer. He received his BA cum laude from Rutgers University, his law degree from the University of Michigan Law School, and his PhD from the New School for Social Research. As a lawyer, he was lead counsel or co-counsel in several precedent-setting New Jersey cases involving public entitlements and housing rights. Professor Pallitto researches and writes on civil liberties, executive power, constitutional law, critical theory, and contemporary political thought. Today, he will be discussing his latest book, Bargaining with the Machine. His previous publications include 3 books, In the Shadow of the Great Charter, Presidential Secrecy in the Law, and Torture and State Violence in the U.S. He also has co-authored and authored numerous articles for the scholarly and popular presses. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Pallitto.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of Seton Hall Week. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, good. Thank you. All right. Well, I'm very happy to be here to talk about my most recent book. And I was going to start out my talk with a little bit of a story about how I came to start writing this particular book. So a long time ago, when I was back in graduate school, I became really engaged with a old question of politics, which is, why do people accept arrangements that are harmful to them? Why do people support governments and laws that go against their own interests? This is an old question of political theory. It's one of the most basic and important questions of politics, I think. Why is it that people do things that seem to be harmful to them? If we assume that people are rational and they're always seeking and pursuing their own self-interest, then these phenomena would be anomalous. They'd be hard to explain. So one of the most important interventions in modern political thought to try to address this question was, of course, Marx's theory of ideology. Karl Marx thought that one of the ways that capitalist domination was able to reproduce itself is because agents of the bourgeoisie or the property-owning class could put forth ideas of the world that other people, including workers, would accept, and those ideas were somehow false or distorted, and yet they would maintain the power relations of the capitalist era, and there wouldn't be a revolution against a capitalist social order in the government that supported it. So Marx wasn't entirely clear on how this happened, and so going forward, when people tried to work with his theory and adapt it to subsequent conditions, they ran into some problems. This was my dissertation project when I was in graduate school, trying to apply different theories of ideology that sort of had their genesis in Marx, but were sort of bringing new elements. Nonetheless, only could explain partially some of the things we were seeing. For example, in 1996, the federal government under President Bill Clinton, the Congress passed and Clinton signed a bill that essentially, as Clinton said, ended welfare as we knew it. So it dismantled the federal welfare system, put strict time limits on benefits. This change was devastating to a lot of the people who I worked with when I was a legal aid lawyer working on public entitlements cases. And yet, if you talk to clients and you talk to welfare bureaucrats, and people in any other context, you'd see this sort of consensus that, well, of course, welfare is bad, welfare is too generous, and so forth. And I knew that these ideas were wrong as a matter of fact because I was working with the law and the benefit amounts and knowing about people's lives who were trying to make ends meet on welfare. So I tried to see whether there was any form of ideology theory that would explain this, what we call acting against interests. And my conclusion was, well, you could explain it to some extent, but there are too many gaps, too many problems, too many things left unaddressed. For one, uh, sometimes when people fail to object to conditions that harm them, they're simply being realistic. And so they know what's wrong. They know the ways in which their interests are being harmed, and yet they also know that they don't have any efficacy in dealing with it. So just because they're not going into the streets and taking up arms and urging revolution doesn't mean that they don't see what's happening. So that was one sort of powerful critique of ideology theory. Another had to do with interests. How do we know what people's interests are? Some people think that the best way to live life is to be as healthy as possible and to have a completely healthful lifestyle to maintain all of your aspects of your being in the best possible shape. Other people say, well, no, a body's like a car. You run it into the ground, and then when you get to the end of your life, you've really lived fully. Which one of those, I know which one of those choices I would make, but how can I say for the person next to me, you are wrong in what you value? Because values aren't really things that are subject to right and wrong. You can talk about the effects of certain values being put into practice, but you can't really say that they're wrong or false. Um, the same with many beliefs, right? If you think about the question of religious belief, there can't be evidence for or against the existence of God, right? So we have a belief one way or another, but it's not based on evidence. So there's so many sort of phenomena of consciousness that can't be addressed by simply saying collectively we're under some kind of a deception, some kind of a delusion. I could go on. Uh, but I think you get the idea. There was a sort of sense of a dead end in figuring out how to address this question of why do people act against their own interests. I thought, society, modern society is simply too thick, too complex to have an explanation that worked like law-like statements we have in the natural sciences, right? So we can make law-like statements about how substances behave, how chemicals interact, what sort of physical force accomplishes, right? But we have trouble when we try to make law-like statements about society, about social science, because the subject matter is people. People do things that are unpredictable. People do things, as is the whole point here, that go against what we think they ought to do. So this is a different kind of subject matter, social science, different kind of project to address this age-old question of why people act against their interests. So then at some point, I started to think, well, maybe there's a different focus. Instead of a collectivist focus on explaining behavior, maybe the way to go is an agent-centered focus. And that's just jargon, right? An agent is a person who acts, right? So if you're talking about the agent's perspective, the person who is acting is the agent, and we look with how they're operating. And this, sort of dovetails with a lot of different aspects of modern social thought. When we think about classical economic theory, right, we're talking about a rational, self-maximizing actor. When we talk about the individual in modern society, we picture that individual to be free and free to make choices. So there's a lot to recommend an agent-focused instead of a collectivist perspective when you're trying to explain certain kinds of actions that people take. So that's the direction I went in. And I thought, one of the things to study, one of the applications to make with an agent-centered social theory would be the phenomenon of technology and technological engagement, because I don't have to tell anybody in the audience here today that technology is central to so much of what we do. I mean, the only reason that we can have this talk today, since we can't be together physically, is because we have technology that allows us to see and hear each other over a screen. So everywhere you turn, you're engaging with some form of modern technology. Some of it helps us to do things. Some of it acts on us, like different forms of surveillance. And as you'll see today, some of it does both. I mean, there are There are technological artifacts that we work with, and while they're working for us, they're also collecting information about us. And when we make choices about whether or not to engage with them, sometimes we think about the data collection effects, sometimes we don't. So what are we doing? We're bargaining. We're deciding, should I get Easy Pass for my car? Should I buy this new car when I know that GPS is included in every model, and that it's difficult to opt out, and therefore my movements can be tracked anywhere I go in this car. So we have to continually make these choices, and in doing them, sometimes we make choices that are explicable. Sometimes we make choices that are such poor choices in terms of what we think would be our interests, and yet we do them anyway. A lot of us do them anyway. So I want to try to understand this encounter that we continually have through this framework of bargaining. So when we bargain, we're looking at costs and benefits. We're trying to get something, but we know that we might have to give something up. This focus on bargaining allows us to see a little bit into the thought processes of the individual agent. And so to do that, in this book, I came up with a set of questions that I apply to the context that I explore throughout the book. So what is the bargaining power of the parties in a transaction? Are we talking about the government, local government, federal government, state government? Are we talking about large multinational corporations who provide platforms and other services to us? The question of the balance of bargaining power is going to tell us a lot about the relationship. I mean, if you just step out of the context of technology for a minute and you just think about ordinary consumer purchases, if you go to buy a television and you're handed the sales contract in the store, you can't take out your pen and start crossing out, well, I don't like paragraph 5. Can we take the word no out of paragraph 6? I mean, you're not in a position to do that. Whereas if you wanted to buy my car, we would be able to negotiate with or without a written instrument, and we're kind of at arm's length, right? You're not bargaining with this huge, powerful entity who sort of set up the transaction in advance. They're just two people. So the bargaining power, relative bargaining power, is one of the questions to look at. Another is what information is hidden. We think we have all of the relevant information in a transaction, but sometimes we don't. We don't always know how our data is being used. One of the things that I discovered in researching for this book is that people really don't understand how privacy policies work. So in the current state of law, most of the time, the only constraint on what a commercial actor, a Facebook or Amazon or anyone else that you're interacting with online, the only law that limits them for the most part is the obligation to adhere to their own privacy policy. So some people, and there is survey research to support this, some people think that just because there's a privacy policy, their data is protected. But of course, if you stop and think about that for a minute, it's wrong. It matters what the privacy policy says. So if the company can write any privacy policy it wants, and we assume they're going to follow it, right? All they're doing is following the policy they set out, which may or may not protect us to a satisfactory degree, and usually doesn't. So is there hidden information about the exchange? What are the gains? What are the losses? In other words, I know what I think I'm getting. I know I'm being able to use Teams, or I know I'm being able to tell people about my life on Facebook. So those are the gains. Do we always understand the losses? So this agent-centered theory that bargaining is the way to look at these social interactions that people have allows us to look at these questions. Are you really getting what you think you're getting? Is this a bargain that you understand? How familiar is it to you? And so in applying a theory of bargaining to encounters with technology, what you see is that we're free and we're not free at the same time. So it would be silly to sit here and say we have lost all freedom to choose. We have no control over the conditions of our lives as a result of a sort of a technologically advanced society that we live in. That's wrong because we do choose things. We make consumer choices. We make affectational choices, about choosing partners, choosing friends, choosing colleagues. So there is plenty of evidence to say that we are able to choose the conditions of our lives. But there's plenty of evidence to say that our choices are limited as well. For example, when you decide to choose products, sometimes companies offering products almost make it into a fetishization where there is this soft drink machine that has a slogan "Choose freely." It sells Coca-Cola products, and so the idea is, isn't it wonderful that you can choose between Diet Coke, caffeine-free Diet Coke, Coke with cherry, Coke with lime, and so there's this array of choices, but they're ultimately about a meaningless thing. So this is one of the examples just to show that we're in a world where we're free to choose and not free to choose at the same time. And one of the things the book tries to do is to map out the limits of freedom that we run up against and the sort of conscious acts that that we engage in to try to exercise choice. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly through each of the chapters because what I did is I set up contexts for engaging and encountering technology. And the first one is the kind of bargains that involve convenience and efficiency. So convenience and efficiency are related because they're things that often drive our choices. We're looking for convenience, we're looking for efficiency. I would ask you to go along with me here in the different use that I apply, and that is convenience has to do with an ease of effort in the examples I'm giving, and efficiency has to do with the savings of money. That's not a perfect differentiation of the two terms, but I use it here because I'm looking at two specific contexts, and I want to isolate sort of aspects of each of those contexts. So the first one is that convenience arises when we try to obtain a trusted traveler or TSA pre-check status, get through the more quickly. So it's easier because we're not subject to the same limits of substances that we can carry. We go to another line and we can travel faster through it. So now we're talking about the ease of effort. It's easier to get through an airport, and therefore it's convenient if we apply for this status. And so the UK has a program. We have a program called TSA PreCheck here. I actually applied for TSA PreCheck while I was writing this book because I wanted to understand exactly what the process of getting the benefit was and also the experience of using the benefit. And I did find out both. So one of the things to think about it right away in this context of airport convenience is that an airport is a machine. It's a machine that sorts people. Some writers have called it a difference machine, right? So you get into the airport and you are sorted. Are you arriving to pick somebody up? Are you getting on a plane? Do you have luggage to be checked? Do you have a ticket? Are you suspicious, where it would be sorted to be diverted to another line for other questioning? Are you a person who has TSA pre-check and you can zoom through in this other line, or are you a person who has to wait in the long security line? So the airport sorts people. It also channels people. If you've noticed, there are two things going on in the sort of design intention of the airport. One is that is security, that you need to be moved in a way where you could be followed and watched. So once you get to the chute for the inspection line, right, you're under the scrutiny of the TSA officials there. But even through the whole airport, and then you're asked to move to one of the places in the airport where which will facilitate not only your movement but the movement of everybody else who's there, and it's done in large part to promote safety. So we want to I say we in the sense of sort of transportation safety planning. We want travelers to be safe, but we also um, we also want to people to engage in commerce. So you're at the airport many times because you're traveling as part of business. But as you're there, you have to pass through all kinds of shops with overpriced goods that are put right in your path of where you have to move. So that's the setup of the airport. And within this setup, we look for convenience. We want to move through it quickly. And the TSA pre-check status allows you to do that. Not when I flew for the first time after getting pre-check, the colleague I was with was also sort of whisked through the same way. People were looking at us like, "What's up with them? You know, why are they being treated differently?" And so you have to be aware that there is this kind of affective element to the accelerated travel. In addition to to just the convenience of saving time, you're being treated like somebody who doesn't need to be under suspicion, somebody who doesn't need to wait, maybe is too important to wait. So all of these things figure into why we might want to take the the application and join pre-check. But of course, what's going on is you're making a record of all of your air travel that can be tracked and followed. In a way, so what? In a way, of course, you know, it's possible to look at flight manifests and find this information already without pre-check. What this does, though, is organizes the data in a very easy to find format, right? You look at the list of TSA pre-check people, and you look at where they've gone every time they've flown. In addition to that, the data that you provide is out of your control once you provide it. So there was a part of the application that said none of the TSA pre-check data will be shared with a private entity. But the thing is, the place where I for the program was a private entity. It's a private agency that works with government to provide identity documents, and it was located in a strip mall near my house. So just to back up a little bit, talking about bargains of convenience and what's involved in them, and why we make them, and what the cost is. Let me talk about efficiency as a second kind of bargain that is attractive to us. So with savings of money, we use loyalty cards in the store all the time, at the pharmacy, at the sporting goods store, grocery store. We all do it. I do it. And the payoff is pretty clear. You know, you use it enough and then you get $10 off the next purchase, or you're able to redeem your rewards to buy something. So there's a direct incentive for you to be a loyal customer by using this card, and you know what you get. Or do you? Because one of the things that you get is you're being treated as a valued customer. So you go in, are you one of our valued customers? Do you have a special customer card? You say no, and immediately you have this feeling like, oh, I don't. I guess I'm not special. And I don't mean to oversimplify. Obviously, we're more sophisticated than that. But the point is that we do have a level on which we're being ushered into a certain kind of consumer behavior, and we're being shaped as consumers to shop with these cards because they give us a benefit. At the same time, our data is being sold subject to very little legal regulation in the United States. Our purchase data is being sold to other companies who can then assemble the data into sort of a composite and make it easier for other people to sell to us in the future. And we get all these unwanted solicitations as a result. So loyalty cards are doing something clearly for us in that they're helping us to save money. On the other hand, they're generating effects that we don't fully understand, like where's our data going? Do we really feel free to say no? I mean, I wrote a book about this topic, and I go to a store and they ask me for a rewards card, and I feel pressure, especially if I say no, I don't want one. It's awkward, right? And that all has to be taken into account when we think about the bargains and why we make them. All right, I think I'm doing okay with time, but I'm going to go a little faster through the other categories. So chapter 3 talks about ubiquity and obscurity. And so the ubiquity of technological decisions is just reflected by the fact that everywhere we turn, we've got to encounter in the infrastructure of our living spaces invitations to consume. And if you think about platforms alone, it's pretty easy to visualize how this works. So Amazon, right, is a platform that allows people to interact commercially or socially, and they sell everything. So it's so much easier, going back to the efficiency again, it's so much easier and time saving to use Amazon to buy everything that we need. And at the same time, it's difficult not to. Recently, we were looking for a particular kind of electronic connection. And, years ago, we would have gone to a Radio Shack store or something like that. But this way, the only way we could find the thing that we needed was through Amazon. So I make a point in the book that when I was living out in the Southwest, I used to hike a lot by myself. So I had this deal with my wife where I would say, when I'm finished with the hike and I come out of the mountains, I'll call you from a payphone. That's how old I am. There were payphones back then. And then you'll know that I'm okay. And you knew I was in the San Mateo Mountains or whatever. So if I'm not okay, you know where the last time you heard from me. So this worked pretty well. But over the years, there were fewer and fewer phone booths, and there were a couple of times when I couldn't call because I didn't have a cell phone and there was no phone booth to be found. Obviously, this didn't make my wife too happy because she thought, I imagine you've bitten by a snake or you fell off a cliff, you're not okay. So the point is that our environment, right, structures these choices for us in the same way with platforms. So it's hard for us to opt out of some of these features of a technological environment because everyone else is using them. And so this collective demand makes them even more ubiquitous, even more pervasive. Connected with ubiquity is obscurity. So we use these things that we can't avoid, and then we don't know what happens after that. And so the sort of the most concise way to present this is that there's obscurity about data flows and obscurity about data harms. So we don't know where our data goes. And once we provide it to a retailer or to government or over social media, we don't have control over it any longer. And you can't put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak. Once you've divulged information, there's no way to get it back because then it starts to spread sort of rhizomatically, like roots through soil. So the disclosure is sort of the last step where you have control. So we don't really understand many times where this data goes. One of the places that it goes, as I mentioned before, is to data brokers whose business it is to take all of this data and come up with sort of idealized purchasers and put them in categories. Some of these categories are pretty disturbing. The FTC issued a report in 2014 about data brokers, and they noted that one of the companies they surveyed gave them information about the demographic types. One of them was Urban Scramble. Urban Scramble was a subject. They constructed a subject who was most likely a person of color, a person who was debt burdened, cash strapped, lived in an inner city, and was sort of financially precarious. So basically, they said, here's the person that we can now market to. So we've created this demographic type, and now we're going to target our marketing toward that person. And so then when people respond, right, because marketers are pretty good at figuring out what people want to buy. Once customers respond, then they sort of reify this created type. And I don't have to explain to you all the problems of the racial assumptions and so forth that are bound up in this. There was another category called rural everlasting. So it was older Americans without college educations living in rural areas, right? And so their purchasing patterns could be predicted and exploited. So when we talk about the data flows being obscure to us, we don't always know that this is what's happening. The data is fed into a broker who compiles it and analyzes it and feeds it back to us as a type that purchasers then live out and make true by actually buying in accordance with that type. Obscurity related to harms is another problem. There's a lot of literature in law and economics right now about, and also in tort law, about how exactly do you conceptualize the harms that obscure data transfer creates. So if somebody has all of this personal information about me, they've acquired it through my Facebook posts, what is the harm? Like when I ask you that question, you think, okay, that's disturbing. I don't want people to know these things about me. But the actual harm is hard to pin down because you haven't lost anything yet. The person can't defame you because defamation means you're making false statements about a person. So a lot of the information is going to be factual. So in other words, legal scholars try to get their heads around what is the harm that we can conceptualize and make into a cause of action in tort so we could bring a lawsuit. And it's hard. Courts have been slow to recognize these theories when they're put forward. One of the problems is that we're sort of always waiting for this future harm. Am I going to be denied a loan? Am I going to be denied life insurance? Am I going to be unable to adopt a child? So these are uncertainties, but we don't know whether these uncertainties are going to materialize. So that's another aspect of obscurity that comes from these technological engagements in the environment that I've been describing. Okay, I think I'm on track here to finish in about 10 minutes. So the next chapter is about smart cities and the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things, you may know, is in our environment. There are computers and sensors embedded in the environment. So a fitness watch, a webcam. One of my favorites is there's an eagle's nest about 10 miles from here, and there's a webcam trained on the eagle's nest. So you can go to the site. I don't remember the name of the website, but you can actually go and watch the eagles when they're rearing their young and so forth. So in other words, these are not computers that are desks. They're computers in our environment to make up a smart home, to allow you to do exercising in a smart way. And I mean smart as clever and also smart in the sense of advanced, technologically advanced and connected. The Internet of Things, or the IoT, has been transposed to the city level, to the environment level, so that now many cities are being fitted with IoT technologies to help governance. And in some instances, this can really assist. It can show, traffic patterns. It can allow people to do transactions without someone else being present. So, there definitely is a range of applications, smart applications that help to use resources more efficiently and so forth. It's not a thing that it would be foolish to dismiss the phenomenon of smart cities wholesale. But again, keeping in line with this bargaining analysis, we give up things as well. So in some cities, Kiev for one, and also in some cities in the United States, police use facial recognition at protests so that they can then contact, and this happened in Kiev, where the people who appeared at a protest were then contacted by government later on saying, you're registered as a protester. We know that you came to this event. Obviously, I don't have to explain to anybody why that's troubling. So there are the government initiatives that are enabled by smart technologies. There are also sort of the corporate initiatives. So these cities come into being either as a ground up city, which are less common, and more common cities that already exist are retrofitted with smart technologies. And so these are state corporate partnerships. So it's not a contract among the people of the city or the people and the government. It's a contract between the developer and the city government. And so you can see how these interests might not be the same interests as citizens would have. So there's a term in the research, Frank Pasquale has come up with a corporate contract. So instead of the social contract that we use to explain how our government looks, there's a corporate contract that's replaced it with smart cities. So as we critique this particular technological engagement of smart cities, there is a problem with the promises that are made. So the government says we're going to make life better in every way. Is that a promise that can be carried out? So in the book, I talk about illusory bargains and unfulfillable promises. The city promises, or Siemens, or whatever other company is planning the development, promises all life will be optimized in every aspect. But of course, that's not true because you can't optimize freedom to consume and efficient use of resources and use of public space and control of public space. In other words, everything can't be optimized, whether through smart technologies or not. It's just an impossibility. Um, Similarly, uh, there's a belief that data-driven solutions are the only kinds of solutions that will make our lives better. And this is also sort of an illusory bargain because data-driven solutions generate more data. And we're not always comfortable with the ways that data are collected and the ways that data are used. So the book takes a sort of a critical look at smart cities and says that as we look at the sort of salutary effects on residents of cities, we also have to appreciate that the entire project has to be bracketed by this question of what is the objective, who are the contracting parties that create these initiatives, what are the liberty costs, especially the ones that aren't immediately visible to us. I saw a film a couple of years ago that a colleague sent me. It was a Pentagon sort of marketing film talking about how, what initiatives would be undertaken by defense contractors, what the Pentagon was looking for research and development about. And it's a scary film because it talks about how, well, the quote is in my book that urban centers will be the drivers where instability will converge. And the whole film is like sort of one shot after another of horror films, burning apartment buildings, armed rebels chasing people down the street. And so the idea is that in order for us to live safe and secure lives, cities have to be pacified. So we have to remember that, of all of the actors that are converging on urban design, there's also that one, and that this is a trend that the authors of video are sort of predicting is going to grow, and this is where research and development needs to be. So we have to factor that into what we imagine will happen with smart cities in the future. All right, so I've got 5 minutes left, and I think that should be just about right to talk about the conclusion of the book, which asks what's left of the social contract. So I've mentioned a couple of times this idea of the social contract. So we teach in our political science classes about how sort of the legitimating element in a modern democratic society is that we created a constitution, and the constitution structures all of our political interaction. And the constitution is, among other things, a contract between the people and the government, so that the government will provide safety and security and other services, and the people will forbear from exercising some of the rights to act against others. In other words, to take other people's property, to harm them. They won't do this. In exchange, they have a promise of a secure existence. So what's left of that, given this agent-centered critique of bargaining with technology? Well, one of the things that we've already talked about this afternoon is the corporate contract. So if there's a corporate contract, how does that fit with a social contract? Second, the capabilities of using remote cameras, Internet of Things, in different contexts has led to some kind of disturbing effects, what we call the proliferation of citizen spies. So there are television shows, or at least there have been in the last couple of years, where you can watch a border site with a camera, and then you can report when someone is crossing that border site, so that person can be apprehended and deported. And you can even do it from other countries. So this is not my insight. This is a scholar named Mark Andreevich who discovers this. But it's almost like playing a video game, except that the consequences are real life for the person who's trying to immigrate. Maybe fleeing from persecution, maybe desperate fear and hunger. I mean, people generally don't immigrate when there's nothing to flee from. So these are some of the aspects of the social contract that might be changed or threatened. On the micro level, right? One of the things we do with social media is we present ourselves strategically, and I don't need to explain that to anybody here. We all do it, right? So we want to put a side of ourselves, even a double of ourselves out there that is all the things that we wish to be. And we can control how that self is presented. So when we do so, we're agreeing to play. We're agreeing to engage with technologies of social media. And what we get from it is that we can present ourselves for marketing purposes, for professional purposes, for dating purposes, for just purposes of a positive self-image, something to do, sharing information with friends. So for all these reasons, we engage in a process that allows us to lose control of our data. And we, to some extent, deem this exchange worth it. That's why we do it. Similarly, we accept a sort of tacit bargain. The political philosopher Isaiah Berlin was alive before the internet age, but he offered a vision of something called the liberal-minded despot. And he said it's possible for a ruler to allow people certain freedoms, but then behave in quite cruel and despotic ways at the same time. And I suggest that one of the things that our modern context of bargaining with technology allows is that we are free to choose what shoes to buy, what TV programs to watch, what takeout food to get, where to exercise, what accessories to get in our cars, right? And as long as we are able to maintain that freedom, the other very illiberal things that our government does, uh, 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 engaging in corruption, stifling free speech, and so forth is okay. So this liberal-minded despot is not an individual, right? But it's a governmental regime that we sometimes see in sort of a neoliberal world. So, all right, I'm going to end there and just say that, well, I mean, there's always more to say. Maybe I'll get to it. But the purpose of the book is to give people a framework for thinking about this thing that we all experience. And then secondly, to urge people to take the bargains seriously. In other words, to think about each of these choices as something that is potentially more complex than we assume. And I don't exempt myself from that because every day, you go through Easy Pass, you go to the store, you buy something online. So it's unavoidable. The only thing we can do is try to be conscious about it. All right, I'm going to stop there. Thank you for your attention, and hopefully there will be some questions.
Just a reminder, if anybody has questions, you could either use raise your hand or use the meeting chat.
The last time I did something like this, I was trying to look at the questions myself, and I ended up disconnecting myself from the entire proceeding. So I'm going to just listen. If someone tells me there's something in the chat, I'll answer it.
So far, we just have a few people commenting. Looks like there's a question. Do you think that COVID will increase the adoption? Oh, now I just did that too. The adoption of smart cities technologies?
Yes, I do. And it's interesting because I finished writing the book in the early spring, just as we were learning about COVID. Book was published in late August, as we were all living through this, quarantine summer, and it really does make the whole conversation more complicated because, I mean, contract tracing is an invasion of privacy, and yet contact tracing. Did I say contract tracing? I meant contact tracing. Is essential, right? If we're going to deal with this disease. So I guess, I mean, really, what it points out to me is that sometimes it's clear that the engagement with technology has to occur. And sometimes we can see that it occurs in a way that shares burdens for among all of us. So, I would never, and it would be wrong to say that these that you should always resist an attempt to collect data because data is, like someone says, the new oil or the new bacon. You see all these different ways of expressing it. But so this is a case where yeah, it's burdensome, and you can see why it's necessary. And we should be concerned that data collection related to COVID is could be misused, and yet it would be extremely foolish to resist it. I mean, we see what's driving it. This sort of external thing, that came to us and wasn't managed very well, but nonetheless, it emerged in the world, and we have to respond to it. So, at least I hope I got what you were asking. But yeah, that's what it made. I thought a lot about this over the summer, finishing up the book. Like, okay, yeah, here's something that's going to generate a lot more surveillance, a lot more data collection, and yet, what choice do we have?
Okay, we have one more question. What options are available to citizens where we can band together to strengthen our rights and protections in this new paradigm? Are there organizations, groups, etc. you would recommend we can research?
Yes. So one group that was that I've really been happy to see they do wonderful work is the Electronic Frontier Foundation, based out in San Francisco, and they've litigated a number of privacy related cases, and their entire reason for existence is electronic privacy. There's also the Electronic Privacy Information Center. So, not surprisingly, people are reacting to this world that we live in. What I did in the book is I added a chapter talking about avenues of resistance, and some of them have to do with connecting with organizations. Others have to do simply with actions. So I talked about how counter surveillance has proliferated, really starting back in 1992 when Rodney King was beaten by police, and there was a videotape of that incident. And so now filming police encounters and other things, this kind of counter surveillance is commonplace. So it is a way that people that people can respond. That you're not only being surveilled, but you're turning the tools of surveillance back on the state or back on another oppressive entity. Similarly, people have turned to encryption. So with email, you can communicate in encrypted communications. Is limited because the other person has to have the private key to open up what you send. But this is something else that's developed in response to sort of pervasive surveillance coming at us from private and government at the same time. Um, Cryptocurrency is another, so that people use cryptocurrency, and it helps them to avoid the regulation that results from cash transfers. So cryptocurrency is kind of a subject for another day, but it is, since it's not backed by any government, it allows people to engage in transactions with less monitoring. Of course, there's another side to it. There's a person, Ross Ulbricht, who started this electronic marketplace through cryptocurrency, and it was used as sort of a drug trading platform, is spending a life in prison for misusing that um, that capability. And it's a strange case because he's a nonviolent offender, but it was sentenced to life in prison. People are fighting against that. And then finally, surveillance art, so we talk about performance art, art that engages directly with the world. And there have been some very interesting instances of surveillance art, sort of protesting the totalizing surveillance that we live under. I talk in the book about one Russian artist who he poured gasoline around the doorway of the Lubyanka and set it on fire, and that was his artwork. So he called it Lubyanka's burning door. And the idea was you couldn't pass by this sort of symbol, the center of surveillance and torture, without noticing it. Whereas every day people walking through Moscow would walk by that door and maybe not think about what it was. But when you set the door on fire, you would. There's another group in Western Europe, and they called themselves Mr. Security, and they would go in front of government security installations and put up cameras and lights and start filming it. And so then when people would come out to say, "What are you doing?" they'd say, "We're doing the same thing you're doing. We're surveilling." So, I mean, it's not that everybody who's listening to this talk is going to go out and engage in surveillance art, but it's important to know that it's out there, that one collective response is to draw attention through art. And then, of course, there's protest. And, protest has gotten sort of a bad name in current conditions that we're in now. But, I would say that the proper way to view it is it's part of an honored tradition, civil liberties tradition in the United States, nonviolent protest to make change. And that is always an option, and we should always fight to preserve, that door being open.
Looks like we have another question in the chat, and then I see somebody's hand is raised from the chat. What comments or feedback do you have with Facebook and Google controlling so much information available to people these days? Control of what information is available and how this can be abused.
Yeah, it's a big concern. I mean, I don't have a Facebook account. I've resisted it because I feel like once you engage, you are giving up all these different things. Everyone probably knows about the Facebook emotion experiment, where different content was fed to users, and then their responses were gathered. Although Facebook says that they did this anonymously, nonetheless, they were using this data to produce certain emotional effects on listeners subsequently. So it's really troubling. And I'm not going to, say that okay, so no one should ever use it, because that's not realistic. People use Facebook, and I may end up using it eventually as well. But you're navigating this thing where you think about how it's going to benefit you, and then you're throwing your data into sort of a collection process, and you're not going to have control of it anymore. Some people say, well, no one cares anymore, but I think sometimes we don't care because we don't know what all the downstream harms are going to be.
Okay, and I see that Michelle has her hand up. Michelle, would you like to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, just what was that second reference? The Electronic Frontier Foundation, and then there was a second one?
The Electronic Privacy Information Center.
Privacy Information Center.
EPIC.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, those are just two. The one that I'm most familiar with is EFF, because I know some of the people there, and I read their stuff a lot. But there are a lot of others too. Of course, the ACLU works on electronic privacy issues as well.
Oh, okay. I think my biggest concern with this whole is probably this whole data concern. I thought I was antisocial, but I'm probably more concerned about data getting out there. So I don't have Facebook either.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I mean, there's so many Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I said I was a parent listening in, so I'm enjoying taking classes periodically.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Yeah, there's so many points where data is collected from us, and if you stop and think about it, it's almost overwhelming. I mean, you go through a toll, with your Easy Pass. You go to the supermarket, use your credit card. I mean, everywhere you post something, you use your email, you buy something online.
And you carry your phone everywhere.
Right. I didn't mention that one. Right.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Go Pirates. Go Pirates.
Looks like we have another question that came in on the chat. Can we get paid for our data being used, or will we be able to charge soon for that?
I mean, one of the problems, I think, theoretically, yes. There shouldn't be any reason why a person couldn't exchange something of value for money. But I think many of the transactions, it's kind of presented as a secondary thing. If I go to buy a fishing rod from LL Bean, right, I'm giving up money and I'm getting the fishing rod, and the sort of secondary transactions are happening without my knowing about them. So yes, in theory, but so much of the time the data collection is a secondary process.
Okay, I see somebody typing away. I'm not sure. I think we did cover all the questions. Anybody else? I think we have a few more minutes for another question. You can either put it in the chat or use the raise your hand feature. Here we got one more. Mm. Do you see a potential that our data trail could become more important than the forms of documentation we currently use to identify ourselves?
Yes, I do, because we document and identify ourselves in kind of mundane ways by showing a driver's license or whatever. But yeah, the data trail is more complete in a way. It's easy to obtain fraudulent physical documentation, and in a sense, the data trail doesn't lie. Although I will tell you one strange thing that I experienced. So over the winter, there was an exhibit at the Shed, the museum in New York City in Hudson Yards, and there was an exhibit on surveillance and technology. So of course I went to it, and one of the installations was called Shadow Stalker, and so you stand in front of a screen, and the first thing that the screen does is it sort of constructs an outline of you. The second thing that the screen does is you put in your email address, and then flowing across this shadow self that you just created are all these details about you. And it wasn't so surprising. I mean, a lot of them had to do with where I've worked, where I've lived, things I've published. But then there were some pieces of family information about extended family, and one of them was wrong. So they had I could tell they were referring to a family member. The name was wrong. And so then I thought to myself, well, this is not being created with any singular intention, right? It's just a drawing from all these publicly available sources. So while generally speaking, a data trail can give a very fine-grained picture of who I am and what I do, it's also subject to error because it's not being done by one sort of controlling entity. It's just gathering all this information from everywhere else, including and the thing I was trying to think with the name being wrong, I couldn't imagine any way that it would harm me. But I thought about other similar mistakes. For example, putting someone in a residence near where a residence where criminal activity was occurring, generating a search warrant. And then and like with Breonna Taylor, she was shot as a search warrant was being executed. So there are real potentials for an error, even though the data trail is going to be largely accurate, errors that could be tragic because they're not being sort of vetted by, in many cases, a aware thinking subject.
Okay, somebody just asked what museum was that in Hudson Yard?
Oh, it was the Shed. So the museum is still there. The exhibit is gone, but I'm pretty sure that there's a what would I say? I think they compiled all the things from the exhibit into a website. So, but the museum is still there. It's a wonderful museum. The exhibit packed up in like late January.
Okay, I see somebody typing. We might have one more question. Oh, just thanks.
Oh.
If I put out false information on the internet about myself as a smokescreen of protection, is that illegal? It's like freedom of speech?
That's a really interesting question that I would want to study. I would say that the short answer is it depends on the context in which you are submitting the information. So if you make a false statement on an affidavit, right, you can be punished, perjury. If you make a false statement in court, same thing. If you make a false statement to a government official, you can be punished for that. So, a false statement by itself is not automatically illegal. It depends on the context in which the false statement is made. That would be determinative. At the same time, I mean, does freedom of speech allow you to say things that are false? Again, it depends. I mean, if you say something that is knowingly false, outside of all the contexts that I just mentioned, and that statement ends up becoming public and harming another person monetarily, then you are open potentially to defamation, because those are the elements of defamation. So the question always becomes, in what context did you make the statement? If I say I caught a 45-pound striped bass and I didn't, then probably I'm not going to suffer any legal consequences from that. I just have to live with the fact that I'm lying about my fishing prowess. But if I say that my doctor is an alcoholic and he drinks whiskey while he's doing surgery, that seems, it could be a sort of a classic defamation scenario.
And as a follow-up to that, he said, then the wrong data you saw pulled about your family has no ramifications. Shouldn't companies be held to a certain standard? Someone put that out there or combined it wrongly.
Yeah, the problem is I have no idea where that information came from. So I saw it. I know that it was somehow pulled from, publicly available data on the internet, but I don't know where someone made that mistake. It could have been a government official misspelling somebody's name. So I don't know. I mean, you can imagine cases where you would know that this was either negligent or worse use of a false statement, but many times there's going to be no recourse because you can't backtrace where the mistake happened.
Okay, is there any more questions? See somebody typing. Okay, we're just getting some comments. Thank you, very interesting. So that's it. Do you have any final remarks that you would like to share?
No, I really appreciate the chance to talk about this material because it's very interesting to me, and I appreciate the questions. And my hope is that it sort of gets people thinking about how we can think about our encounters with technology and the privacy costs when we focus on the agent, the person, and what they're considering.
Well, that's great. And if anybody has follow-up questions, we could share your contact information if that's okay. And we already put in the chat a link to your book, and Lori shared a story that she wrote about your book. So again, if you missed that, that's in the chat. There are links to the book and a little bit of a overview about the book.
Thanks so much, Jen.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. This was very interesting, and we hope you enjoyed this time. And we're also going to be, like I said, posting this session on our on-demand page, on our Seton Hall Week page. So if you know people that missed it and you wanted to send them, I know that all this information, especially for parents, they probably want to share it with their students as well. So feel free to share that link that we post on our Seton Hall Week page. And we hope everybody has a good night.